Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Eugenie Scott. She's the Executive Director of the National Center for Science Education, author of Evolution versus Creation, and she's been awarded 7 honorary degrees. We're lucky to have her. Thank you.
Very nice to be here, thank you. Not sure whether my presbyopic eyes are going to work better with the page or with the screen, so I brought them both, so belt and suspenders. 5 years ago this month, I was in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania at the Kitzmiller versus Dover trial. The trial concerned the legality of a policy about teaching intelligent design in Dover, Pennsylvania, and NCSE, my organization, acted as advisor to the plaintiff's legal team on scientific, pedagogical, and religious issues, and also on the creationism and evolution controversy. In December 2005, Judge Jones handed down a decision that thoroughly discredited the Dover policy, declaring that the teaching of intelligent design was unconstitutional advocacy of religion in violation of the First Amendment. The setting was a federal district court. The issues were First Amendment law interpretation. The issues weren't about whether science and religion are compatible, whether you should be nice to religious people, or even directly, whether evolution is good science. The issues had to do with whether the practice of the Dover School Board violated the First Amendment's requirement that public institutions be religiously neutral. Establishment Clause law, as currently interpreted, allows some reflection of religion in the public sphere, but only as a secondary issue. A school district can, for example, provide transportation to parochial school students because the reason for the practice is to facilitate the education of students, even if parochial students benefit from the practice. So whether the Dover policy had a secular purpose was critical to both the plaintiffs' and defendants' cases. The defense had to demonstrate a secular reason for teaching intelligent design. The statement during a public meeting by school board member William Buckingham that 2,000 years ago someone died on a cross, can't someone take a stand for him, is inadequate reason to teach it. To simplify a complex trial, the defense had to convince the judge that ID was indeed a valid science. It also required them to propose that evolution scientifically wasn't all it was cracked up to be, which would justify teaching the criticisms of evolution presented in the textbook Of Pandas and People. In addition, they contended that presenting both evolution and idea was a good critical thinking exercise, and therefore its teaching was of pedagogical value. Our task was to counter each of these claims. We could and did easily show that ID was a religious idea, and if we could demonstrate that the claimed scientific validity of ID was a sham, the Dover policy would be revealed as having no secular reason for its passing, and the First Amendment would be squarely on our side. We used 2 approaches to support our view that ID was not a valid scientific discipline. One was to look at the fact claims of ID. Are they backed up with empirical evidence? Are they tested? Do they hold up? The second approach was to look at the nature of science itself and ask, does ID fit the common understanding of what science is and how it works, as defined by scientists and the courts? Ken Miller, biologist from Brown University, and Kevin Padian, paleontologist from UC Berkeley, had the task of showing that empirical claims of ID are invalid, as is the factual material presented in Of Pandas and People. The main claim of ID, that there are biological systems incapable of being explained through a natural cause like natural selection, was amply refuted. Specific claims about the irreducible complexity of the bacteria flagellum, the immune system, the clotting system, were shown in detail to be simply wrong. Our lawyers also attacked the logic of ID, which, like that of creation science before it, relies on demonstrating its own validity by disproving evolution, what a judge in an earlier case, McLean, had called a contrived dualism. Our other focus, questioning whether ID met the standards of science, was addressed by all 6 of our expert witnesses: the 2 scientists, the philosopher of scientists, the philosopher of science, the theologian, the historian, and the pedagogical expert. Every one of them hammered home the same point. Scientific explanations reflect a practice known as methodological naturalism. Scientific explanations are restricted to natural causes. Of course, the ID side's view is that methodological naturalism is an unwarranted restriction on science that impedes it in obtaining a full explanation of natural phenomena. The second part of our philosophy of science argument was to make the case that for ID to be considered science, it must be testable, and that its claims could pass empirical test. Because ultimately ID is a statement of divine intervention, it is untestable at a fundamental level. Any test or experiment that involves an unconstrained variable such as an omnipotent deity could have any outcome. Therefore, it is not possible to come to valid conclusions and build scientific explanations where God is invoked as a cause. Now, be aware that we're talking about a court of law, not a seminar in philosophy of science. Both the science and the philosophy of science we presented were simplified, though accurate. A court has to come to a conclusion regarding contending claims. A court doesn't have the leisure of a prolonged theoretical and philosophical discussion over what the meaning of is. Our expert witnesses were reflecting the settled interpretation in how courts look at science. Among other decisions, the Supreme Court in Dobert versus Merrill Dow identified 4 factors for determining whether evolution is scientific: whether the theory or technique can and has been tested, whether it has been subjected to peer review and publication, whether there's known or potential rate of error, and whether the theory or technique is generally accepted in the relevant scientific community. I think it would be difficult to find many practicing scientists who would disagree with this minimal description of how science works. The Dobert standards aren't a definition of science. They certainly do not exhaust what we think about how science works, but they are very useful, as they should be in a court of law, when a judge has to decide between contending experts. Lawyers have a very cynical expression. For every PhD, there is an equal and opposite PhD. We hit ID on peer review, probability of error, general acceptance, and especially on testability. And our findings of fact and conclusions of law, which, by the way, I strongly recommend you go to our website and go to the legal page of the Dover trial and read this. These are the summaries that the defense gives and the plaintiff's lawyers give at the end of the case, where they're trying to persuade the judge as to whose side to come down on. The findings of fact and conclusions of law in our case were written by Richard Katsky, who is really the unsung hero of the Dover trial. Richard was never on the witness stand, but he was the writer for all of the briefs that we wrote, and he's a fabulous legal writer, and he really did a wonderful job on the FFCLs as well. We wrote, "The evidence submitted by both parties demonstrates that intelligent design's core assertion is that for intelligent design to be science, the long-standing scientific ground rule of methodological naturalism must be discarded so that supernatural intervention can be considered as a scientific cause. Not only is this radical proposition inconsistent with McLean, as well as the definitions of science offered by all the major science organizations, but there was no evidence submitted at trial that any other area of scientific inquiry has ever been opened up to supernatural causes. That is entirely understandable. Supernatural causes are not testable, so intelligent design has not been and cannot be tested. But Dobert, McLean, and the scientific community agree that testability is a core element of the scientific method. Indeed, defendants, expert scientific philosophers, Stephen Fuller, insisted that testability is the hallmark criterion of science, and he conceded that intelligent design has not been tested. So if ID cannot make claims that can be verified, in fact, its fact claims are false, and if it doesn't use the same handbook that other scientists use, there's no good reason to teach it. To compare evolution with ID as a critical thinking exercise similarly has no pedagogical value. We did a very good job trashing the defense's claim for a secular purpose for teaching ID, which left only the religious purpose for teaching ID, which led to it being declared unconstitutional to teach in Dover schools. Now, the reason I went into so much detail about the Dover trial was because it illustrates NCSC's general approach to the issue of creationism and evolution. In Kitzmiller versus Dover, we had a specific goal: convince the judge that the teaching of ID was unconstitutional. Generally at NCSC, our goal is to encourage people to understand evolution, hopefully to accept it, and allow it to be taught to students in schools. We also encourage an understanding and appreciation of science as the best way people have developed to understand the natural world. We are not an atheist organization. To succeed in Dover, we relied upon sound science. Some of you might remember Margaret Talbot's statement in the New Yorker that testimony at the trial was like the biology class you wish you could have taken. We also relied upon a clear understanding of the nature of science and how it works. We do this as well in NCSE's day-to-day activities, where respect for science is combined with the political and communications awareness necessary to achieve our goals. Remember, we're dealing with science education, which in the U.S. is highly politicized by elected school boards. The U.S. is a democracy. We cannot force decision makers like school board members or legislators to teach good science. We need to persuade them. Scientists are neither a voting bloc nor a contribution base. They have no political clout. We build coalitions of all the stakeholders in a community when we have one of these flare-ups. These stakeholders include scientists, teachers, parents, business persons, and members of the mainstream clergy. Time and again, we have found that some of the most vehement opposition to the teaching of creationism comes from very religious members of mainstream Christian denominations and their clergies. This is also true, by the way, of the Dover legal team. I learned long ago that appreciation for science is not limited only to non-believers. I think it's worthwhile to think a moment about religion in general. One handicap that those of us who are immersed in the creationism and evolution controversy have to overcome is the tendency to think of religion as being primarily about explaining the natural world. It isn't. But it is exceedingly difficult to define religion in a way that includes world religions such as Christianity and Buddhism, as well as tribal and other local religions, of which of course any definition must. A definition I use as an anthropologist that is suitable for Christians as well as the Dani of New Guinea is that religion is a set of beliefs and practices that link people with a non-material reality. This reality, of course, is perceived differently from culture to culture. Valhalla, Elysium, heaven, and the 5 underworlds of the holy people are very different from one another, and Christians, ancient Norse, Greeks, and Navajo have quite different rituals and beliefs. If you're going to understand religion, you have to understand it cross-culturally. And although many religions have explanations for the origin of the natural world, such explanations are not the main focus. Religion is meant to link them to their gods or ancestor spirits or spirits inhabiting elements of the local environment and so on. Time and again, we have found that some of the most vehement opposition to the teaching of creationism comes from very religious members of mainstream Christian denominations and their clergies. This is also true, by the way, of the Dover legal team. I learned long ago that appreciation for science is not limited only to non-believers. I think it's worthwhile to think a moment about religion in general. One handicap that those of us who are immersed in the creationism and evolution controversy have to overcome is the tendency to think of religion as being primarily about explaining the natural world. It isn't. But it is exceedingly difficult to define religion in a way that includes world religions such as Christianity and Buddhism, as well as tribal and other local religions, of which of course any definition must. A definition I use as an anthropologist that is suitable for Christians as well as the Dani of New Guinea is that religion is a set of beliefs and practices that link people with a non-material reality. This reality, of course, is perceived differently from culture to culture. Valhalla, Elysium, heaven, and the 5 underworlds of the holy people are very different from one another, and Christians, ancient Norse, Greeks, and Navajo have quite different rituals and beliefs. If you're going to understand religion, you have to understand it cross-culturally. And although many religions have explanations for the origin of the natural world, such explanations are not the main focus. Religion is meant to link them to their gods or ancestor spirits or spirits inhabiting elements of the local environment and so on. One should not generalize to religion based on only the belief system with which one is most familiar. But even if we are to limit ourselves just to Christianity, this set of beliefs is not primarily about explaining the natural world either. Part of one book, Genesis, concerns this question. The rest of the Old and New Testaments, taken as a whole, is about the relationship of people to God. Most Christians do not sit up nights thinking about how Grand Canyon was formed and whether the great unconformity was shaped by Noah's flood. Because Christianity is not primarily about explaining the natural world, it is not necessarily antithetical to science. Empirically, it is clear that many Christians appreciate and embrace science. It is certainly not accurate to say science and Christianity are compatible, any more than it is accurate to say science and Christianity are incompatible. Whether science or evolution is accepted by a Christian depends on what tradition he or she follows, and even then, there is considerable idiosyncrasy within traditions. On the floor of the new science building at Notre Dame is a meter-wide insert in the marble citing Dobzhansky's maxim, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." Our expert witness, John Haught, a Catholic theologian, is fond of saying, "Nothing in theology makes sense except in the light of evolution." Most Catholics accept evolution, but not all. Most Baptists follow a more literalist interpretation of Genesis and believe God specially created living things, including Adam and Eve, but not all. Remember that in 1981, Southern Baptists were one of the plaintiffs, the anti-creationists, in McLean versus Arkansas. A member of NCSE in Texas told me that he sends his child to the Lutheran parochial school so that she'll get evolution, because he has no confidence in her receiving instruction in that topic in the public schools. Some Christian denominations are strongly biblically literalist, Pentecostalist, holiness traditions, and so forth, and they don't accept evolution. The term conservative Christian is often used to identify evangelical and fundamentalist traditions, since those two terms are so poorly defined and used in so many different ways. But think of conservative Christians as sort of the other side of Catholics and mainstream Protestants. Conservative Christians also should not automatically be viewed as rejecting evolution. The BioLogos Foundation, established by Francis Collins, but he has nothing to do with it anymore, consists primarily of scientists trying to reach out to their fellow evangelicals to encourage a more science-friendly perspective. When I looked at the page this morning, I noticed they are highlighting Dr. Dennis Lamoureux's book, the title of which is "I Love Jesus and I Accept Evolution." Theologically, you can hardly get more evangelical than Dennis, and you can hardly find a more enthusiastic evangelist for evolution to the evangelicals. Lamoureux has said, "Evolution makes it possible to be an intellectually satisfied theist." Okay? So where are we with all these data? It is empirically obvious that one can be a theist, a supernaturalist, if you will, and still think science is good, valuable, and inspiring. For my goals, those of increasing the understanding and acceptance of evolution in science, and given my understanding of how science works, I am happy to accept all comers. It is methodological naturalism that is necessary for science, not philosophical naturalism. I am a philosophical naturalist. It works for me. But I see no need for a Christian who loves science and is fascinated by evolution to have to join me in my disbelief. What is necessary, however, is that like me, a person of faith has to employ methodological naturalism when trying to explain the natural world, which is what science does. If a young earth creationist says, "God created the earth 6,000 years ago," there's a fact claim in there that I can disprove through science, the 6,000-year one. If an old earth creationist says, "God created the earth 4.3 billion years ago," there is nothing science can say to disprove him. If I, or more likely a Christian theologian because I don't care, want to dispute the God created part, theology or philosophy would be employed to debate the first part of that sentence. But a more important point I want to make here is that human beings have other interests than science. And this is what I meant when I said Christians really don't sit up nights worrying about the origin of the great unconformity in Grand Canyon. Christians and non-Christians, human beings around the world sit up nights thinking about survival and about their loved ones. Will rain come at the wrong time and ruin the crop? Science may tell you the frequency of storms during the coming month, but it isn't going to help you deal with the meaning of that concern and how it weighs on you. Is my sister going to be able to get off drugs? Science may tell you the physiological effect of drugs on your sister's nervous system, but it isn't going to do anything to help you cope with how you feel about her losing her job, neglecting her kid, and her life going to ruin. My father is dying and I'll never see him again, and I will have a huge hole in my life. Science can tell you why his body degenerated, but it isn't going to do much to help assuage your grief. Look at those poor refugees in Sudan, having lost their homes, their livelihood, their loved ones. The social sciences can perhaps explain the faulty political systems that resulted in a broken government unable to keep order, but the explanations themselves are independent of the compassion you feel when you hear of their suffering. Let me confess something to you. About 27 years ago, I was 9.5 months pregnant with my daughter. I was the size of a small mountain. I was so sick of being pregnant. Plus, I was having lots of second thoughts about what kind of craziness possessed me to get pregnant. Neither my husband nor I had a permanent job. I had never thought of myself as a mother. I'm a professional. I'm too busy to have a kid. What was I thinking about? This is never going to work out. If I could have, honestly, and I've even told her this, so not telling tales out of school, if I could have resorbed her 2 days before birth, I would have. I have 2 words for you: perinatal hormones. Once the perinatal hormones kicked in during and just after delivery, and once I held my new baby, I felt an indescribable surge of love, protectiveness, care, and I bonded like iron to that helpless little pink creature. Okay, as a biologist, I can tell you the sequence of enzymes and hormones that kicked in around childbirth and their effect on maternal psychology, but so what? It is the meaning of the experience that is important, not the physiology. Knowing the physiology that kicked it off might be a mildly interesting component of the bond of love I feel for my daughter, but what is important is how I feel about that bond, which is distinct from any additional scientific understanding of the process. Science is great, but it's not the only thing important to human beings. And the Dani or the Christian or anyone else on this planet may appreciate how science can explain or assist with problems, concerns, or even joys and delights they might have. But they also focus on the meanings of these concerns, and that is something that goes beyond science. Now, personally, I'm a humanist, not a supernaturalist. It is my secular humanist philosophy that I turn to when I need to deal with grief, compassion, joy, or any of the rest of the suite of things outside of science. Christians and people of other faiths turn to supernaturalism to provide the same comfort or the understanding or to encourage and sustain compassion. This is independent of explaining the natural world. The conflict is between secular philosophies like humanism and supernaturalism, not between supernaturalism and science. Science is used by both secularists and supernaturalists to support their points of view, and this is not illegitimate. What I think is going beyond what science can do is to make the claim that science necessarily compels either a supernaturalist or a secularist philosophy. Picture 2 plants growing in soil. The 2 plants are in competition for light, water, nutrients, which one gets the fungus, and so forth. Neither plant is in competition with the soil. Similarly, supernaturalist religions like Christianity or the Navajo, for all of that, aren't in competition with science. They are in competition with secularist philosophy or with each other. And to me, this flows naturally from the methodological naturalism that is the hallmark of science. Science per se is not a worldview. If you think science is a worldview, read that article a couple of days ago, I guess yesterday, in the New York Times about Chinese scientists. Scientists are supposed to be these honest, and no. Read about this. There are thousands of papers having to be withdrawn because of rampant stealing of data, rampant plagiarism, and so forth. Science is not a worldview. It's a way of understanding the natural world. Philosophical naturalism is a worldview, and it draws much from science as a plant draws from soil. Science can provide information that a non-supernaturalist like me can use to build a worldview, but that is a different claim than science itself being a worldview. It is an equal opportunity methodology suitable for anyone, regardless of their personal philosophy out of which they create meaning. And yes, many supernaturalists, many Christians also use science to refine their sense of meaning and purpose. Which is why I have no problem working with people, religious and non-religious, on our common goal of increasing understanding of science and evolution. If your goal, this was the lead-in, if your goal is to increase the number of atheists, fine. Cultivate your plant and watch it grow. But your plant doesn't own the soil. Thank you very much.